And the mindset of people around America's cities change, becoming more violent. But guess what? We've been through this before, and we know what it takes to resolve crime issues. That we have to make every tool available to us and using our intellect and strategies towards a solution. Years ago, community policing put us in the headlines of the national news, Wall Street Journal, and how it was used to reduce crime along our commercial corridors. With concerned people working together with the city, we can do it again. I'm proud to be a partner with Mayor Bowser and her efforts to resolve violent crime issues in the city. I would like to introduce you and bring forward our mayor, Mayor Bowser.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good morning. We're very pleased to be here on 8th Street Northeast. I want to thank Anwar and all the businesses and community members who have joined us today. And as I have been talking about for the last several days since our crime summit, we're here to talk about a piece of legislation that I will introduce to the council aimed at increasing public safety in our city. We're specifically focused on strategies that we have identified, or places in the law, I should say, where we think that there are gaps. And we think that filling those gaps will make our city safer. I'm joined by members of my public safety team, including the Chief of Police, Robert Conti, the Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, Lindsay Appiah, the City Administrator, Kevin Donahue, as well as members of our community services offices. So let me just say some words, and then we will have an opportunity to hear from the chief and take your questions. So we know that we need to make some changes, and that making the right changes requires us to be introspective, to evaluate, pivot, and quickly redirect our resources where necessary to adjust crime trends in the district. So today I'm announcing a package of legislative, programmatic, and budgetary proposals that will move us in the right direction and allow us to build a safer, stronger DC. The legislation that I will send to the council is common sense legislation. For example, we know that addressing violence in DC means we have to tackle illegal guns and people using illegal guns who are causing the havoc that we see in too many DC neighborhoods. So the legislation will increase penalties for illegal gun possession. It will also provide greater discretion for the courts to determine who should be held pre-trial, including defendants previously convicted of a violent crime, while they await trial for the new violent crime. We proudly, of course, in our city believe in second chances, but we also believe in accountability. To that end, we are recommending strengthening the provisions that allow people to petition for early release to ensure that the experiences of victims and the discretion of the courts is given proper consideration. We also have an obligation to protect those most vulnerable in our community. And one critical part of our approach will focus on people who are in vulnerable positions, like our transit workers. One of the updates that we will also make addresses the concerns of many partners in our criminal justice ecosystem around increases in domestic violence, and an update to the strangulation crime as a felony assault we know will keep more people and our families safe. We are also recommending penalty enhancements for violent crimes against vulnerable adults or people with physical or mental impairments. We also know that our complex criminal justice system needs more transparency. So the legislation will require the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to report on its process, on the process and outcomes of its members. And this is going to help us better understand the programs that are working and those that aren't working. And finally, for those things that don't require changes to the law, that where we have identified gaps, I will issue a mayor's order directing my deputy mayors to present all the steps necessary to make those changes. So we know there isn't one single solution to ending gun violence. Public safety is an all-day, everyday, community-wide effort. And the safety of our community is my top priority as your mayor. And even with the complexity of our system, I recognize my responsibility to make this system work. And we're relying on partnerships with all of you to get that job done. So with that, I'm going to turn to the Chief of Police.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and good morning, everyone. Since I took over as chief, you've heard me talk about accountability in different spaces and places throughout our city on different crime scenes, much like one of the crimes that we had to occur over the weekend. But accountability is very important to me, so especially as I look at the end of my career here with the Metropolitan Police Department, I'm happy to hear that we are really moving forward in the space of increasing accountability across our city within the criminal justice ecosystem. If someone commits a violent crime in the District of Columbia, no matter who they are, we as the Metropolitan Police Department have a duty to hold those accountable. More importantly, we as a city have a duty to hold violent criminals accountable. It is unacceptable to me that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to them committing a homicide. It is unacceptable that our teenagers in our city have access to illegal guns. It is unacceptable that someone has a modified handgun that turns into a fully automatic weapon operating in our community. It is unacceptable to me that a 10-year-old little girl riding home with her mom, dad, and 2 siblings last night got caught in the middle of a barrage of gunfire on Mother's Day and is now in the hospital fighting for her life. That is unacceptable to me. It is unacceptable that a bullet from someone firing shots outside goes through the window at 4 o'clock this morning of a 12-year-old sleeping in her bed and strikes her in the leg. It is unacceptable that petty disputes and disagreements are being settled in our city with gun violence. For people that are choosing to indiscriminately fire a gun in our community, they need to be held accountable. We have been focusing on a whole of government approach to keeping our community safe, from our officers being problem solvers to the multi-agency effort to focus on our nightlife areas. But MPD is only part of the criminal justice ecosystem. This new legislation being introduced by the mayor will help hold people accountable and create stricter penalties for people responsible for causing fear and harm in the community. As the mayor said, the legislation will help us bring stricter penalties for ghost guns and machine guns and other illegal weapons. It will also focus on making sure we protect our victims and their families and allow them to have a voice in the early release process. And this will allow for greater discretion for the courts to determine who should be held pre-trial, including defendants previously convicted of a violent crime while they await trial for a new violent crime. We're doing everything possible as MPD to address the violence in our communities, but we need to work together. as the criminal justice system and as a community as a whole. This legislation will help reshape the criminal justice ecosystem here in DC and hold people accountable. I want to thank our mayor for having the courage and empathy for our communities to do everything that she can to make our communities safer. It is my hope that these common sense recommendations will not fall on deaf ears. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Deputy Mayor Pia to join me here. We'll take some press questions, and we will have time for a few community questions, and I'll also be here when the press conference concludes. Yes, Sam.
So Mayor, how is this going to be communicated? Is this legislation for the council? How does this work?
Yes, this is what I just talked to you about were some major components of a piece of legislation that I will introduce to the council. You know, generally the chairman of the council introduces legislation on my behalf when we have a piece. We have previously sent a piece of legislation some years back that we called Safer Stronger. That was the legislative component of actions that we took at that time when we were experiencing a spike in crime to drive crime down. So this is a similar legislative package. It shouldn't be considered like this is where we are right now. We have in our budget, actually, we've moved some other, what I consider safer, stronger pieces that the council is also voting on. And that includes our legislation to reverse a council decision to remove police from schools, and also make clear how we're going to reform the Department of Forensic Services. That's in our budget, along with other investments in our public safety ecosystem. But this is a piece of legislation. I assume that it will be referred to the Committee on Public Safety and the Judiciary. I had an opportunity on Friday to talk to Councilmember Printo to give her a heads up of some of what would be included, and we look forward to going over that with her in some detail, having a public hearing, and getting the legislation adopted.
Could you address your appearance before the Oversight Committee tomorrow? And does this help to allay some of the concerns that the Republicans, particularly on that committee, have referred to DC as being dangerous and unsafe? Does this help to alleviate some of those concerns from them?
I'm less concerned about their concerns. I'm more concerned about the 700,000 people who live here, the 2 little girls that the chief just described, who have the right to be safe in their homes. I'm more concerned about our business owners who've in many cases put their life on the lines, their life savings on the lines to have a business here, to employ DC residents. So I'm concerned about the people who live and call DC home. I'm concerned as well, to set the record straight with members of the Congress. We are experiencing a dangerous trend in some crimes in the city, not unlike cities in their own states or in their own districts. So we're going to be clear about what we're doing to address it. Yep.
WTOP. It seems like I've been covering crime for 10 years in this city. It seems like in the last couple years, it's just younger and younger and younger when we're talking about defendants. Last week, there's this 12-year-old kid who has 9 carjackings that he's being charged with. Now we have a 10-year-old who wasn't involved, but who's hurt. When you think, I mean, the kids in the city are being hurt and being involved. I want to hear some emotion from you on that, because I know you're taking legislative action, but have you spoken to the 10-year-old's family, and what should the city feel about their kids?
The city loves our kids. If you're asking how we feel about our kids, we love every one of them. And what I know is that the vast majority of them are just fine. Except if there's anyone who is not fine, any one of them, we have to be working doubly hard to make sure they have great schools, that their families are supported, and that their communities are safe. And so that is what we're focused on. MPD will continue to investigate. Can you imagine? I can't even imagine what a family is going through that was driving down the street. So we're very focused on making sure that we are holding people to account. Let me ask the deputy mayor to talk specifically about youthful offenders. You probably know she comes from the world of working with youthful offenders from DYRS. And the tools that we've heard from community members that says, what do we do with a child that repeatedly offends? And so we think that this legislation gives us some additional tools.
Sure. One of the things that we said at DRS over time is that we love our kids, and we have to ask ourselves, what does love look like in public policy? And so when we make proposals like we're doing, like the mayor will be introducing, this is what love looks like in public policy. It does look like boundaries, and so we'll be proposing that courts be given back some of the discretion that was altered under a piece of legislation called the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act, that when young people are engaged in violent crime or gun crimes, that courts have the discretion to go ahead and securely hold them. Secure detention in the district can absolutely look like the Youth Services Center, which is our secure facility on Mount Olivet, but it also looks like shelter care, where there are some young people who need a higher level of supervision. And a shelter home is a group home that says if you were out, if you were engaged in or alleged to have been engaged in a violent crime, there may be some supervision that we need for you to have to ensure that even when you are in your pretrial or any part of the system, that you're getting some services and supports to get you back on a positive path.
Well, a couple things. One, you say you're less concerned with Congress, and I get that, but still you chose here to make this announcement, and it's not lost on us that this is where the congressional staffer was stabbed, and many of the questions that Chairman Mendelson and Councilmember Allen faced from Congress, which you're sure to face tomorrow, were about the fact that that congressional staffer was stabbed by a person who was on release. And so I'm just wondering if you can kind of square that for us. It's kind of circling back to that question about how important was it for you to have this all out on the table before you go before Congress tomorrow?
Well, we've been talking about changes to the law for some time, Mark, but we also know that we have a new opportunity and new leadership at the council to address some of our policy recommendations. As I mentioned, some of these recommendations I made several years ago that weren't enacted, including dealing with, and I'm have our lawyer next to me, so I won't pretend to talk about the specifics of the rebuttable presumption in legal terms. Let me say what it means in practical terms. In practical terms, what our judges tell us is that somebody could have been convicted of a violent crime, and when they have committed another violent crime, our law, and you can disagree with it, but we're dealing with it for violent crimes, says that the judges have to really jump over hoops to detain somebody who's committed a violent crime while they wait for trial. And it also means that every part of our system, including the trials happening, have to happen fast in order for us to ensure public safety and the fair administration of justice. So what this law says is it gives the judges more tools and more discretion to look at all of the facts when making a decision about detention before trial. The location decision we made, Mark, really has more to do with a lot of the people who have gathered here, an unfortunate spree of break-ins that have happened to our businesses along H Street. So we focus most on gun crime and violent crimes, but the threat and the fear of having the property crimes that we've seen here is also impacting the sense of safety. So that's why we are here.
I don't want to misinterpret what you had been talking about this for weeks leading up. This in my interpretation of what you actually wanted was that you wanted to compel judges to hold pre-trial people who had already been convicted of violent crime, rather than just giving them more discretion. Would you like to go further than, if you had the ability to, would you like to go further and just make it mandatory so that the judges didn't have discretion if they were faced with a suspect who was charged with a violent crime who had previously been committed or was out on parole for a violent crime, that they would automatically be held?
I do think, Mark, that the facts matter, and the ability to get the legislation passed is also an important consideration for what's before us. I don't want to make light of this recommendation or the arguments that we're going to have to make to get it enacted. But this will represent a big step forward in the court's ability to look at all the facts, use their discretion, and make decisions to hold individuals that need to be held pre-trial. Yes.
Are the courts in the state right now where defendants, whether or not they have a violent past, can have a speedy trial? My understanding was that at one point we had a shortage of judges and there was a backlog of cases. So with people being detained, how do we ensure that folks can get through a trial within less than a year?
I can't, and maybe the deputy mayor will add, I can't speak to the time frames for the courts. They do have, I think, an 8-person vacancy, so they need 8 judges, and of course that number changes as people leave or retire. So yes, having a full complement of judges is very important to the fair administration of justice in the city. Do you know where they are now with felony cases?
Certainly, you're correct that COVID caused a backlog. They are, as the courts have been open now for some time, they have increased the pace of getting through that backlog. There is still some, and certainly, as the mayor said, we will always advocate for our courts to have a full slate of judges, and so that will certainly assist them in working through. But they are making strides in getting through that backlog.
As far as your recommendations for your deputy mayors and the agencies, how do we go about ensuring a holistic approach to tackling crime when in your budget proposal, ERAP, SNAP, and other quality of life benefits were cut? You know, seeing as though those are the things that in some sense prevent crime, you know.
Well, they weren't actually cut. When you talk about ERAP had a large infusion of federal dollars. So we didn't cut our local commitment to ERAP, but the federal dollars have evaporated. And no one should expect that we will be locally able to contribute for any sustainable amount of time those types of dollars.
But as far as the holistic approach, what is your expectation of your deputy mayors as far as addressing the root causes of crime among juveniles and adults? Because this is a public safety conversation, but as far as the other agencies and deputy mayors, what's your expectation?
So we're right now talking about the gaps in the law, mostly related to accountability, but also related to some aspects of community empowerment. We're changing, for example, the ability of our residents to take advantage of our camera rebate program, which has been very helpful to MPD in solving crimes. Some of those cameras are coming to the end of their useful life, and we want to stay focused on what we need. So let me just give you an idea of what some other gaps that I've identified that I'm going to ask the deputy mayors to outline some steps to make changes in short order. We've talked, for example, about our violence intervention programs, the incredible amount of millions and millions of dollars, some federal dollars that we've been able to use for it. And we have to outline the future of those violence intervention programs. How are they going to be organized? What contract vehicles are we going to use? And how we can report better outcomes. Another thing, some of you participated in our youth forum after the summit, and there is a big discussion on how families who has a young person who may or may not be justice involved, but is demonstrating that they're at risk, at serious risk of committing crime or being a victim of crime. And how can we have an alternative for that family? So our CFSA and Department of Human Resources and the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Resources will help us come up with some alternatives for them. Similarly, in schools, which I still regard as the safest place for our kids, with adults who they trust, and just massive amounts of resources from teachers to counselors to nurses who are in the school buildings to help kids. Now, one much less aspect of policies that affect children that has changed over the last several years is our ability or the type of discipline that we can administer at school. So we have to have a serious discussion of what different changes do we need to give to our school officials about in-school discipline. And that's going to be important. And finally, we're also going to kick the tires more for more opportunities in our DMWA agencies, for example, for second chance, what we sometimes refer to as second chance employment in the district government. Yes, Stephanie.
I have a few questions. First, I want to ask, what from the Public Safety Summit last week actually went into this bill that we're looking at right now?
I think a lot, actually.
Can you name some specifics, though? Because you said that some of these provisions you had introduced before. You've been working on this for a long time. So what is the new thing from the Public Safety Summit that came out of this, that went into this?
I think every provision was emphasized in the Public Safety Summit.
Okay, and then my follow-up question is, I mean, this has to be passed by the council. So how soon, if passed, could this actually take effect? And how is this immediately addressing the need to fight crime in the city right now?
It's addressing it because those are the gaps in the law that we identified. Now, there's some things that the mayor can do using emergency power. Changes to the law like this require the council to act.
So are you looking at doing any emergency power changes to address the immediate needs?
You
right
wouldn't
now?
be able to do this by emergency.
Is there anything emergency related that you're considering?
We are working every day with every part of our ecosystem in our police department. Yes. Sam?
From the chief, details about these shootings over the weekend.
Yeah, so in the case of our 10-year-olds, just after 9 o'clock p.m., where a young child was in the car with her family. I talked about that during my comments, where unfortunately this young child was hit by a bullet that was not intended for her. I think it's important to say to the community at this point, and I didn't mention this in the comments, but we truly need the community's help with that case. To the cowards who fired those shots, you hit a 10-year-old child. I'm asking for the community's help, like I have in other cases involving young children and just other cases in general, to please step forward if anyone knows anything about this. We believe the suspects were operating a dark or black small SUV. If we are able to get any images from CCTV, we will certainly put those images out to the community. We had another case this weekend, a homicide that happened. This homicide victim was the son of an MPD sergeant. His mother is one of our own, and he died as a result of gun violence. And his father, his stepdad, is also an MPD sergeant. So these cases, you know, you've heard me speak about this very clearly, I think, to community about how people respond differently depending on their proximity to pain. And this pain that we've experienced this week in these shootings, whether it involved a child or didn't involve a child, you know, it's Mother's Day weekend, man. I mean, these things, you know, mean something. This other case where a child in her home, in her bed, and because somebody decided to fire a gun at 4 o'clock in the morning for whatever reason, we have a child that got struck. I looked at a video this weekend from a shooting that we had just before coming here. Some argument, some dispute between groups of people go down for whatever reason. Our suspect, or our victim in this case, starts firing a gun. Our victim starts firing a gun first. That victim then gets shot. He's taken to a hospital. Several firearms are recovered, including the one that the victim was using. The people who took him to the hospital armed with firearms. It's like some communities, man, are washed in gun violence and guns. And when you think about the reason why some of these people are getting shot, petty, simple disputes, like over what? Where someone decides that the way to settle this is through the use of a firearm, an illegal firearm, I should add. In most cases, the firearms that we recover are illegal. And I talked very extensively about what those firearm recoveries have looked like over the last couple of years. Over 3,000 this past year. That's a lot of guns showing up in our city. It's a lot of guns in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And when we talk about how these firearms, in many cases, being converted, more shots being fired, the instances of where other people, unintended targets, sometimes are shot in those cases, like we talked about with these 2 children. So whatever side of the coin you happen to be on, intended, unintended target, dispute, whatever, it's all senseless gun violence at its root. And those are the things that we have to focus on. So when the mayor talks about closing the gaps, these aren't all the gaps. We're going to continue to kick the tires, as she mentioned, to identify where are the gaps in the system. Most people, some of the things I'm sure, as people read through some of the changes that will be made, these are things that people would have thought would have already been in place, but they're not. There are gaps in our system, and if we're truly going to experience public safety, this ecosystem that you hear me talk about all the time, it's not just a cute phrase. It is a real thing that is dependent upon each part of it in order to be successful. The prevention side of things, the enforcement side of things, the accountability sides of things. If any of those pieces are uncoupled, we have gaps in our system, and we have to do all that we can, starting with legislation, to start closing those gaps, Sam. Megan.
Hey, Chief, I'm wondering if you can speak briefly about why we're here. The mayor mentioned some break-ins and some robberies. Can you talk anecdotally about what's been going on in this neighborhood and how you're changing or increasing patrol here?
Yes, so along the H Street corridor, we have one business, for example, that have been broken into like 2 or 3 times, where the person is coming in stealing alcohol, stealing money, that kind of thing. And that shouldn't happen 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning in some instances. That impacts all businesses. And whether it's 1 robbery, 2 robberies, or a robbery that occurs at the far end, close to the bridge, in the 200 or 300 block of H Street, or it happens in the 1100 block of H Street, is still along this corridor, and everyone is impacted by that. So in response, our first district, this area here, this part, the part that is east, this is east of on H Street is generally part of our nightlife focus. So we have had to try to tweak the resources that we have a little bit to have our officers a little more present across this corridor to extend themselves out doing their business checks. One of these areas along here is a part of their focus patrol efforts. So we're doing everything that we possibly can to lock up the people that are responsible, utilizing the video. The community has been helpful in providing videos that will help, I believe, ultimately identify the suspect responsible for at least one of those or a couple of those burglaries that we're talking about. So those things, again, I thank you for pointing it out. Property crime, I know that some people are only touched by, when we talk about violent crime things, but if you're a small business owner and you put your life savings into a business and someone is coming in there and they're stealing things that you've worked hard to put in that business to make them available for other members of the community, and somebody is coming in stealing it, I mean, that hits personal for you. So we want to do everything that we possibly can to bring those people to account as well. And even in that space, again, this is property crime. That's a whole nother discussion. What happens when that when that case, that guy who's broken into 3 or 4 businesses, what happens when he goes through the system? Those are things that we have to watch, identify those gaps, and make sure that that business owner is not concerned about that guy getting out the next day or the day after that, coming back burglarizing that business again. Mark, you had a question over here. Oh, Emily, I'm sorry.
No problem.
Was that for the mayor or for me?
For you first, and then one for the mayor. I'm wondering if you can say if there's any connection between the feud between Mayfair and Quarles and the shooting of the 10-year-old last night?
We don't know if that's the case for certain, that it has anything to do with any particular neighborhood dispute. That is obviously an investigative route that we normally take to see if there's some type of neighborhood, if it's some type of a music video dispute or something like that, but we just don't know at this point of the investigation.
And then one question for the mayor. We spoke to some residents in that area who expressed frustration with you, saying that you weren't doing enough to stop crime. What would you say to them?
I would say if they're hearing gunshots and a child in their community became a victim, I completely understand a frustration with crime. And we're going to do everything that we can with the resources available to stop it. Yes.
Mayor Bowser, one for you and one for the chief. Mayor, it seems like in the legislation that you want to make it, or at least raise the bar for the Second Look Act, for people to be released under the Second Look Act. Can you talk about why you want to make those changes? And am I correct in interpreting that you want to make it at least a little tougher to qualify for Second Look?
Again, we've been talking about our concerns with victims' voices as it relates to the Second Look Act. And court discretion. Let me ask the deputy mayor to talk a little bit specifically.
So one of the things that you've heard us say repeatedly is we want courts to have discretion. That is certainly a change that we're proposing, is that courts have discretion in determining eligibility under the Second Look Act. There's also language, as the mayor said, to elevate victims' voices, where courts will have to consider victim statements, and they will have to consider things like remorse. And there's language currently that says that courts can't consider the cold-blooded or brutal nature of the crime. We believe that it's important that in making determinations under that piece of legislation, that the courts have the ability to look at all of those things: remorse, the victim's statement, the nature of the crime. And so those are some of the proposals that we're making.
And then, Chief, you spoke about the gaps and that there were things that people would have assumed were already in place. And I think one of those might be that your investigators and prosecutors don't automatically have access to GPS data for suspects who are under court supervision. Can you talk a little bit about the frustration and how that may have hindered investigations up to now?
It absolutely does. I mean, I want to pause for a second to go back something that she said to make sure that wasn't missed. She talked about the courts not being able to, when they're considering resentencing someone or releasing them, for the Second Look Act, that they do not take into consideration what the person, what crime it is they were charged with, what they did, the heinousness of the violent crime. That's not something that's taken into account, right? I just want to make sure that when you talk about gaps, like I think most people would assume that was something that would automatically happen, like, oh, you take in consideration what this person did.
Nancy, explain what the Second Look Act is, how it was recently expanded.
Sure. So the Second Look Act, or the Incarceration Amendment Act, is an opportunity for individuals who've been sentenced for longer sentences, who are under 25 years old, to petition the courts to be released early, right? Like, so they get a second look at their case. It previously covered a certain group of people, but the council expanded that to all defendants under 25 years old. And so, like we said, the nature of the crime is not relevant. The brutality of the crime is not considered, and it is compulsory. The court must release if they find these certain things. And so certainly we believe that all of those things it's necessary for the court to have discretion, for the court to consider remorse, for the court to consider the nature of the crime and the offense in making a determination whether someone is at a point where their sentence should be released and they should be sent back to community.
All right.
Chief, could I just get you to finish your thought on the GPS frustration?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously you're investigating cases. You want to be able to have real-time access to that information. I mean, we certainly know. I mean, we've had homicides in our city that have occurred where the person is wearing the ankle monitor from some type of supervisory agency, and we just think it makes good common sense that the police have access to that information if we are investigating a case, and we want to see, who was in that block at the time when the murder happened. Do we have anybody who's leaving at a high rate of speed? We would want to know that, and having access to that will certainly help for more speedy investigations, identifying suspects, witnesses, etc.
Mayor,
This is our last round, and we'll start walking around. 1, 2, 3. Yes, sir.
yes. Do you actually think that council will give any pushback to what you've proposed today?
Yes, I do, but it'll be part of the legislative process. Where what we need them to do, though, is not sit on it. We need to have a public hearing, and I think that it's very important, and it's enough time that they do it before they go out on recess in July. And so they can do it. And so that's what we would be pushing. And Mark asked the question earlier about one aspect of this. In the public hearing process, things get turned up or turned down or they remain the same. So I think it's important that we have that public hearing as soon as possible. Stephanie?
Chief, in terms of the saturation of firearms in the city in the wrong hands, do you guys know any more on where these guns are coming from? We had a 12-year-old with a firearm. Is there some kind of ring that you're looking at, and is this in any way connected to the burglaries we've been seeing of gun shops around our greater D.C. area here?
So I wouldn't say that they're directly connected necessarily. We do know, and things have been pretty consistent, that the majority of the illegal firearms in the District of Columbia come from south of here. They come from Virginia, they come from South Carolina, they come from North Carolina, they come from Georgia into Washington, D.C. Those that are not the personally made firearms. So in general, that's where they come from. We work very closely, as you probably already know, with the ATF to just make sure that we watch those trends. Matter of fact, I even think that information may be on the ATF's website in terms of where firearms in the District of Columbia are recovered. But we work very closely with our neighboring jurisdiction partners to see if any of those firearms that may have been stolen and a break-in or something, if they show up on the streets of the District of Columbia, and none of that is really standing out for me at this moment.
Okay, Sam, you have the last question.
So, Mayor, tomorrow, I guess it's tomorrow you're going before the Congressional Committee? So tomorrow you go before the Congressional Committee. I expect you'll be criticized a lot about the shootings in the city and the crime by people who are opposed to gun control. What about that issue? On the one hand, you have people that are opposed to gun crimes, but at the same time, they are opposed to gun control. What are your thoughts there?
Well, more largely, Sam, is that we know that they're opposed to gun crimes in the city, and I know that they should be opposed to gun crimes in their states. So what we'll be talking about while we're going to be talking about D.C., we could just as easily be talking about any state in the United States of America. COVID, post-COVID, the levels of gun violence that we've seen around the country are pretty remarkable. And we could also be talking about how assault weapons and the lack of an assault weapons ban is also making our country less safe. And not only is that not unique to Washington, but it is unique to America, where children and people going to malls and people going to churches or synagogues have the threat of mass shooting. So it is, it's sad. It's sad that this Congress and the Congresses before them haven't taken real action to make our country safer. All right, we have to wrap up, guys. Thank you, everybody.
We now return to our previously scheduled program, already in progress.